Hi everybody, this is Jared Bruning with the Daily Bell Ringer, and this is Daily Bell Ringer Now. Again, this is my little history, but primarily for history teachers because I'm a history teacher myself. And today I am super excited because, I'm a history nerd, and there is one podcast that I just absolutely love that I've been listening to for the past couple years. It's basically become my go-to podcast for if I'm mowing the yard, if I'm driving in the car, and, I let the kids watch a movie in the back and I'm getting to listen to something in the front. I usually listen to this podcast. There's this podcast called Portraits of Blue and Gray, which is a biographical podcast of some of the major people involved in the Civil War, and it is an absolutely just great podcast. And so with me today, I have Chris Moore, who is the host of Portraits of Blue and Gray. And I guess, Chris, I'll allow you to go ahead and introduce yourself here if you don't mind.
Oh, thanks, Jared. My name is Chris Moore, as you said. I am a writer based out of West Virginia and the creator of the Portraits in Blue and Gray podcast.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being on here with me today. Actually, I didn't tell you, I've got a couple of buddies of mine that I actually told them, I said, hey, Chris, the guy from Portraits of Blue and Gray, I'm going to get to talk to him in a couple of days. And they were like, really? You're actually going to get to talk to him? And so I've got a couple of friends of mine who are some other Civil War nerds that really love listening to some of your stuff. So yeah, again, I'm really excited today to get to talk to you. But I guess, I just wanted to start out here, just talking about kind of, background of Portraits of Blue and Gray, kind of, how you got started with it. So I guess, why did you start your podcast?
Well, I guess it's been about 5 or 6 years now, and when podcasts first started to catch on, I kind of gravitated towards history podcasts and became a big fan. And I just one day kind of dawned on me, I can give that a try. It's things I like to do: research, writing, recording, and the barriers to entry with podcasting. That's one of the cool things about it as a medium. Is that the barriers to entry are very limited. You just have to get a computer, a microphone, and come up with an idea, something to talk about, and you're good to go. I mean, there's a learning curve as you do it along the way, but yeah, it just seemed like a good idea, and I rolled with it.
Yeah, so it's something you're passionate about, obviously, talking about Civil War history. And the thing about your podcast that I'm just always so struck by is the amount of detail and research that I can tell you put into each one of your podcasts, because there is stuff that, you find all kinds of primary sources. You bring in so much detail that it's really astounding. And I guess I'm curious, and I don't know if this was one of the questions I'd sent you before, but how much time do you usually generally spend in putting together one of your podcasts?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. It's a lot more than I would like. I wish I could get them out a little quicker, but for every hour I put out, there's probably 50 or 60 hours of research time and putting together a summary of what the show is going to be about.
Yeah, it's really cool. You find some really obscure primary sources like now my mind's going blank. I was just listening to the podcast about the bank heist up in what was
St.
it?
Albans.
St. Albans, that's it. For some reason, I kept on having the Dahlgren affair going into my head. St. Albans, yeah, that St. Albans one. You found, that it's kind of one of those more obscure incidents of the Civil War. But you found all kinds of just really neat little primary sources of people talking about the details of what happened when these Confederates rode in and robbed the town. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that's such a crazy story. Just all around that they those guys got it in their head that they would sneak up into Canada and cross the border into St. Albans and kind of resulted in an international diplomatic incident. But that just adds to the fun of the story.
And two, like for me, when I talk to my students, I teach 7th and 8th grade American history. When they think of the Civil War, it's purely, Virginia and, some stuff in the Western theater, and that's it. They don't even think about what's going on like up in Canada and Vermont. And to kind of tell them that story, it's like, wow, that's kind of a crazy crazy, just event that happens there. And I love the way too, if you listen to that podcast, and I highly recommend if you're watching this, check out Portraits of Blue and Gray and check out that episode, because you also do the whole thing about about Jesse James and how he got started into, being a bank robber and everything. And you kind of draw the parallels there. So I guess I'm curious, are you a big like Western fan, like the old West stuff and everything?
Yeah, I like the movies. I'm not a fan of. Well, I shouldn't say I'm not a fan. I don't know as much about the history of that period, and that which you're referring to in that episode. That was kind of an accident. I just stumbled upon some materials about Jesse James, and it ended up just fitting together pretty well. He was involved as a very young man in the guerrilla fighting in Missouri, and that was some nasty stuff. So you can kind of see how that would inspire someone towards a life of crime as it did. But the guys in Vermont, the Confederates that robbed St. Albans, they weren't like that at all. This was their first, and as far as I know, only criminal activity they were involved in, and they were very much amateurs when they robbed those banks.
Yeah, but it's interesting the way you make the point. They stole more in that one heist than Jesse James and his gang did in their entire career as criminals.
Absolutely.
So that was just like astounding to think about and everything. And actually, interestingly, just this past week, my family and we were actually on vacation down in West Missouri, and there's a bunch of stuff. Have you ever heard of the Bald Knobbers before, down in Southwest Missouri?
No,
you ever
I
heard of
can't
that?
say that I have.
Yeah, there's this group that during Reconstruction, it was basically a group of vigilantes who were kind of upset about all of the the bushwhackers and everything that were still kind of active down in Southwest Missouri, and they kind of went on their own little rampage of kind of taking revenge on some of these guys. So again, my wife was kind of asking, what's the deal with the Bald Knobbers, and I kind of took her back to a little bit of what you had talked about with Jesse James and his whole thing in Missouri during the Civil War. So again, my wife's not a big history nerd, but she's heard a lot of your stuff because she asked me questions, and I'm like, well, hey, I was listening to this really cool podcast, and he was talking about this in the podcast and everything. So, well, I guess another question here is what is your background? I mean, are you a history major, or are you just somebody who loves history? I mean, what is kind of your background and how you got into really focusing on Civil War history?
Well, I minored in history. As far as becoming a big fan of the Civil War, a lot of that had to do with geography. As we mentioned, there's just so many interesting historical sites to hit around this area. But when I was in college, I had a really great class. The professor was his name was Dr. Mark Snell, and he was fantastic, and that really sparked the interest. And one of the things about the studying the Civil War is that there's never a shortage of new materials. You know what I mean? There's when I started doing the podcast, there was a brief period where I was concerned that I would run out of interesting episodes to do, and now I've come to realize that I'll never have enough time to do every topic that I'd like to do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you come up with some great detail. I mean, one thing that I was going to bring up that you've really changed my mind about, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to this. In my class, when I would teach about George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac, kind of, early on in the war, I would kind of rip George McClellan a new one. I would just be like, George McClellan was just completely inept, didn't know what he was doing, and I know that he was good at training the Army. That was his, a lot of historians have always said that. But one thing that you brought up in some of your podcasts about George McClellan, and specifically about him, is just what an intelligent guy he was. That, some of the things that how many different languages could he speak? Do you remember? I forget. It was like 3 or 4, right, or something like that. Yeah,
I don't remember off the top of my head, but part of the reason they sent him over to the Crimean War is because he was one of the few guys in the U.S. Army that could talk to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the point I make too, that it is a great point that you brought up in your Portraits of Blue and Gray, is that most of the material we have about George McClellan is written based on his letters he wrote to his wife, and I bring that up to my students that I always think of him as being kind of a jerk. But honestly, if you probably heard the way that I just like how open and completely honest I am with my wife, you would probably think that I'm just a complete jerk as well. And I think it's kind of cool the way you brought that up, how George McClellan really most of what we know about him comes from those letters. And he literally wrote like every single week was writing at least one letter to his wife, right?
Oh yeah, they were sending them back and forth, not just during the war, but before and after as well. It was, you kind of almost feel bad about it, like you're snooping a little bit, but. Mm-hmm. I think at some point he kind of wanted those to eventually come down to history because he knew what he was doing. He knew that was he was living in a very important historical period, and that he was creating a record. Like we said, he was a brilliant guy, so he knew what he was doing. Now in that episode, I did take the contrarian view on McClellan. I'm not 100% sure that I'm sold on that, but I think that he is one that maybe deserves a second look. He had. The big difference between him and Grant, he had a plan that might have worked if Grant had been in command when he came up the peninsula. But with McClellan, he was just too concerned about taking the casualties, and Grant didn't like to take the casualties either. But he was a guy that recognized that the choice was high casualties or not winning the war, and that was an easy choice for Grant.
Yeah, that's something, again, I bring up with my students as I say, Grant, to me, Grant was not necessarily a brilliant military leader. He just had determination. He was just like, I'm going to do this no matter what. At least that's kind of my interpretation of Grant. You might disagree with me there, but again, he's very, very different from McClellan and everything. So, but again, you've definitely changed my mind some about McClellan. Oh, one other thing I was going to bring up about McClellan, and again, I don't know if you've ever looked into this or not. I remember I had a buddy of mine a couple years ago that he was working on his master's in history, and actually his thesis that he was writing was basically an argument saying that McClellan was purposely doing what he did early in the war to set himself up for a presidential run in '64. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think he was purposely doing any of what he was doing just to simply set himself up to take Lincoln out in '64?
Well, he definitely had his eyes on the presidency, and even back then there was a lot of talk that McClellan was, he had a lot of friends from the South, and he was very sympathetic to the South. He was a Democrat, basically his whole life, which that was the South was the Democratic Party's stronghold at that time. As far as whether he'd be willing to sabotage the war effort for personal political gain, I kind of doubt that. But you never know.
Well, that's why when I was talking to my friend about this, I was like, if that is true, you could argue he's one of the greatest villains in American history if he was purposely sabotaging this huge conflict for that and everything. So I guess I'm curious. You kind of touched on this, saying that you're a history minor, you had some professors that really inspired you, but what is it that really drew you specifically to Civil War history? Just you said just simply because of the area you live in, kind of in the Virginia area.
That was definitely part of it. The Civil War also is just as being a fan of American history in general. It's still the pivotal event in American history. You have the American history before the Civil War and after the Civil War, and there's plenty of examples you could cite to. The obvious one being that the country had slavery before the war and didn't afterward, but. Mm-hmm. And another one that you hear people talk about is how the United States was spoken of in the plural before the war. So you might say that the United States are pursuing Western expansion, and then after the war, you would say the United States is considering involved in World War I or whatever. And then if you get more into the fundamentals of how the nation functions. Before the war, the federal government was a lot more limited, and the role of the presidency was a lot more limited. And then Lincoln kind of set the precedent for a more powerful president, and the federal government's role after the war, it was never the same. It became a much stronger government. They did roll that back for a few decades after the war, but especially when you get into the 20th century. It's I wouldn't say it's a different country, but the underlying philosophy of government is different.
Yeah, exactly. And and I apologize. I keep on bringing it back to my experience teaching junior high history. But in my history class, I cover the U.S. Constitution, and one of the biggest things we talk about are Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And and I'm basically, when I cover the Constitution, I'm already starting to draw them to the Civil War, because I'm like, you know what, this whole issue of who's in charge, the federal governments or the states, is not going to be resolved until we get to the Civil War. This is going to be the event that's going to solve that issue. The other thing, I guess I was going to tag on there to you saying, why the Civil War is such a pivotal moment in history. I think too, if we look at, Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, and how he is so adamantly talking about how we need to preserve the Union and preserve a democracy that is going to be preserved. And, I try to make the point to my students that the United States, we still are an experiment in democracy, but especially at that time, other nations looked at the United States and we were kind of like still not legit yet. And they thought this is proof that democracy can't work. This Civil War is proof that it's going to fail. And personally, I feel like if Lincoln did not have the determination to keep the country together, who knows where democracy would be to get today? I mean, around the entire world, who knows where it would be? So, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of worldwide ramifications that the Civil War had in, preserving the Union and keeping democracy around. So, I mean, I agree 100% with what you were saying there about, the federal government and everything. And then, too, about I think democracy is extremely important.
If I could just throw something in real quick, a good example of that is that, the French had their revolution not too long after the American Revolution, but then that got turned around, and one of the Confederate generals was a guy they called him Prince Camille, but he was a bona fide French prince. France still had, Napoleon III was still in charge, so this is a country that we think of as being at the forefront of Republican Democratic kind of rule, and they were still had an empire while we were fighting the Civil War.
Huh.
So I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Well, of course, then, too, sorry, I'm just throwing in all this random stuff, but, you just recently did an episode about the New Mexico campaign and what was going on in the southwest part of the United States during the Civil War. And, again, I think what a lot of people forget about is, like, the imperialistic, and you brought this up in your episode about France invading Mexico at the same time as the American Civil War is going on. And, of course, that's where we get the celebration of Cinco de Mayo and everything, that battle on May 5th and everything of 1862. So I thought that was kind of, and again, I'm trying to point out to anybody listening or watching, you really need to check out Portraits of Blue and Gray, because he brings in so much great detail and everything. So, one thing I love about your podcast, and I apologize, I hope I'm not embarrassing you by talking about this, but you are such a great storyteller in your podcast. Like, the way you flow through the podcast, it keeps me engaged the whole time. I mean, there's really nothing that like is a lull in there. And one of the things I really love, and I know we're kind of getting off the whole history thing here, I feel like, are you a little bit of a sports fan as well?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And I assume you're a sports fan and a movie fan as well, correct? Because a lot of times you'll bring in some like Lord of the Rings things, and for us nerds, who really are into love some sports statistics and love some Lord of the Rings, you kind of throw those things in there every now and then, and I love the way you kind of bring those in to tell your stories and stuff. So again, I just think those are great. But I guess one of the questions I had here for you. Can you think of, because I think any history teacher should be listening to your podcast, if they're just trying to beef up on, they know they're going to be covering, Nathan Bedford Forrest in their next class period. They should listen to your podcast about Forrest or any of these individuals. But can you think of any other ways that maybe your podcast might aid history teachers or anything like that?
Well, Nathan Bedford Forrest would be a tough one to talk about in the classroom. But with that said, I'm not a teacher, so I wouldn't presume to give any advice on in the actual classroom time. But the best I would say would be that making history a story is really a big part of making it interesting. There's kind of when I am coming up with a podcast episode, I always two questions I ask myself is is this something that's going to I'll be able to turn into a decent story, and is this something that people are going to care about? And if the answer to either of those questions is no, then that's one that gets scrapped, at least for the time being. So Yeah, having a good story and fitting the smaller stories into the bigger picture, I think, is really important, especially for younger people who are just getting into history. There's a big difference between popular history that's fun and entertaining, and that's a great gateway, and then there's this other academic history that can be a lot more boring. And I think you're going to have a lot more success getting kids interested in history if you stick to the stories rather than the minutia.
Yeah, well, I think you do a great job of kind of bringing those both together because, like I said, you have so many great details, but yet you weave it together in such an interesting story to listen to overall and everything. So I think you do a great job with that. So I guess what are some things we might be looking for, here in the future from Portraits of Blue and Gray? What are some things you've got, I guess, on deck right now or looking at?
Well, we've been doing some stuff on the Trans-Mississippi Theater, which is everything west of the Mississippi River. That was something I realized that I had completely neglected early on. So the first episode in that was the New Mexico episode that you mentioned. And what I'm working on right now is going to be something on the Red River campaign, which was a trip up the Red River in Louisiana and Arkansas. They were trying to take the Union Army was trying to take Shreveport, Louisiana, and kind of one of the things that makes that really interesting is that it was what they call combined arms campaign, where you had the Navy and the Army working together. The Union general that was leading that expedition was a guy by the name of Nathaniel Banks, who before the Civil War he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Which struck me as funny because I just can't imagine, any of our modern politicians, suiting up and going and leading an army into battle. But it was a different time, and of course Banks didn't do that well, so maybe that's for the best.
Actually, my father, he grew up in Shreveport, and when I was a kid, he took us to, I want to say it's the Battle of Mansfield. Is that one of the battles along the way? Yeah. So when I was a kid, I remember going there and them talking about the whole Red River campaign. Of course, I was 8 years old at the time. I didn't really understand everything I was seeing there and everything. But whenever I think of the Red River campaign, I always think of going to that battlefield with my dad when I was a kid and everything. So
when you're a kid, and I experienced this too, visiting the sites is huge. It really. You understand a lot more what was going on when you're there and walking where the historical figures were walking, rather than just reading it in a book. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, you make a great point there because you're in kind of Virginia East Coast. You've got all kinds of access to lots of places. I'm in Central Illinois, so we've got the Lincoln sites. I've been there dozens of times to all the Lincoln sites here in Illinois. But honestly, walking a battlefield, it's just an experience that I try to express to students. It's like if you ever get the chance to stop at a battlefield, you need to go there because there's something about standing in that exact location where all of these events, took place and everything. So,
could agree.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. You kind of got to get that hands-on experience of being right there. So I guess I'm curious, and again, I'm doing this from a personal perspective. I actually grew up in Springfield, Missouri, and one of the big reasons I love Civil War history is because my parents always took me to the Battle of Wilson's Creek. When I was a kid, I don't know. Have you thought any of doing anything about Wilson's Creek and the whole, what was going on there in Missouri?
Yeah, and when I started looking at Jesse James, that was originally I was going to do an episode that was going to focus on Missouri. I probably will do an episode on that eventually. Maybe I'll touch on it. There's probably another one coming up where I'll focus on the Indian Territory and some of the fighting that went on there, which just another piece of interesting trivia that there were Confederate generals and Union generals also who were Indian chiefs, which is just fascinating to me. But it seems like that might be a good avenue to fit in something about Wilson's Creek.
Well, I was going to say, if you do Wilson's Creek, of course, you'll talk about Nathaniel Lyon. And I guess I'll tell you this one quick story here about Nathaniel. This is always a story I tell my students whenever I'm talking about like Wilson's Creek in my class that they always find fascinating because it's just a weird story. I don't know if you've heard this before about Nathaniel Lyon. Of course, he's the first general to be killed in a battle during the Civil War. But the Union was in such a rout or running in that battle that they forgot to grab his body when they left the battlefield. And so these Confederates come up and they find his body laying there, Nathaniel Lyon. And a few weeks earlier, Nathaniel Lyon had been talking trash in the St. Louis newspaper about all these secessionists in Missouri. And these Confederates were like, we're going to desecrate the body. We're going to burn him or something. And apparently this commander rode up and said, no, he's a general. We got to return him back to the Union side. And so they returned the body to the Union troops, and the Union troops fled to Springfield, Missouri. And then shortly after, they fled from Springfield, and again they left Nathaniel Lyon's body there. And so these Confederates show up, and here's Nathaniel Lyon laying there again. But the deal was, he had got shot through, it was one of his legs, and he got hit in the big, femoral artery or whatever. And he had bled out, and they couldn't embalm him because the embalming fluid would not stay in. And so the Confederates are like, we got to do something with him because it's August, it's getting hot. We have this body here. They end up like burying him in a rose garden there in Springfield at this lady's house in Springfield. And he stays there throughout the rest of the war until the war is over and his family travels to Springfield and digs his body up from this rose garden and take him to Connecticut to bury him there at the family plot. So
Well, it makes you wonder if Nathaniel Lyon's guys maybe weren't too fond of him too.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's a good point. But I think that early in the war they were so disorganized they didn't know what to do. They were just like they just started retreating and just forgot the body there. So anyway, my students always love that story. And I mean, I don't know if you might do some research and find that's completely wrong. That's the story I've always heard when I was a kid going to the battlefield. They would some of the historians there would tell that story.
Sounds right to me.
Yeah, so we'll see. But anyway, yeah, I'm excited for some of the stuff you got coming up. I'm definitely going to check out that, the Red River campaign stuff, because again, I would say I'm more knowledgeable about the the major campaigns, part of the Anaconda Plan to capture Richmond and the Mississippi, but not some of those other kind of those, I guess you could say, minor campaigns almost that happened during the war. So I'm excited to hear about that. But again, if you get the chance, check out Portraits of Blue and Gray. I suppose you can go to any. I guess what would be the best way to find you on? Is it like Apple Podcast, or where would you say would be the best place to find your podcast?
Yeah, whichever podcast app you use. If you search for Portraits of Blue and Gray, it'll come up, and it usually comes up if you just search for Civil War podcast also.
Yeah, and of course you always spell the gray with an E, right?
Yeah, that's right. Good point.
Yeah. So make sure you spell gray with an E, and of course I'll put a link to Portraits of Blue and Gray in the description for this video. So if you want to check it out, go down there and check it out. So Chris, thank you so much for joining me here today. I know it was just a quick little interview here, but I just wanted to share this with any history teachers. Again, anybody that loves history, maybe checks out Daily Bellringer videos. Check out Portraits of Blue and Gray. I can't speak highly enough of this podcast and everything. So again, Chris, thank you for joining me here today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to do it, and I appreciate all the kind words you said about the podcast throughout the interview.
All right. Well, thank you again for what you do, and I guess we will sign off here. All right, thanks.